Hello everyone, today we dive into a spine-chilling and mysterious story from the Vietnamese countryside, a tale that, once you've heard it, you won't be able to forget. Have you ever heard of a nameless grave? Or stories of restless spirits tormenting the living? If not, then get ready, because this story will take you into a haunting world where the line between the living and the dead becomes blurred. Today we're excited to continue our series of Eerie village ghost stories with the thrilling and suspenseful tale called The Mistaken Reburial of a Demon's Grave. It's an honor to share this story with you tonight. Now, please sit back and listen as I, Din Sun, take you through this terrifying tale. But before we begin, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming chilling and captivating stories. Let's uncover the secrets that you may have never known. An hour later, they arrived at the master's house, placing offerings before him. "Master, we've come to ask for your guidance with the exhumation of my father's grave," Mr. Nyo said. Sensing his unease, I didn't ask any more questions. After cleaning up, he placed chrysanthemums on the grave, lit some incense, and said a prayer. Once he finished, he told me, "All right, bow and place the incense, and then we'll head home." I did as Grandpa said, bowing and setting the incense in place. As we rode home, I couldn't help but glance back at that nameless grave. A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I could have sworn I heard a faint, eerie giggle from somewhere deep within my mind. Frightened, I quickly turned away and clung to Grandpa, refusing to look back. When we got home, Grandma was sitting in the yard. She called out, "Did you and Quinn just get back from the grave? How was everything out there?" Grandpa propped up his bike and replied, "It's done. The grave is still fine, but it's been so long that it needs some repairs. I think we'll need to talk to Ngaya's family about fixing it up together." Grandma sighed. "I've been telling you that for a while now. But do you think Ngaya's family will agree? I'm not sure they want to do it. But you know, if we don't take care of our ancestors' graves, it could affect the family's fortune." Grandpa assured her, "Don't worry. This time I'll make sure they help with the repairs. It's time we fix it up." Their conversation was interrupted when Uncle Tang rode up on his motorbike and asked, "Dad, has Njok's family arrived yet?" Grandpa replied, "Not yet. Call your sister and see where she is." Uncle Tang dialed his phone while Grandpa took a deep puff from his pipe and said, "Quit nagging me about smoking. I'm addicted now, there's no quitting." Grandma chuckled, "See? I told you, but you wouldn't listen. You cough all night long from smoking so much. What's so great about that?" Grandpa laughed and said, "Oh, leave me alone, woman. I'll do what I want." Tang, sensing Grandpa's irritation, didn't say anything more. Although Grandpa loved us dearly, he was a traditional man, set in his ways. Once he made up his mind, no one could change it. And if you push too hard, you might get scolded. About 30 minutes later, Aunt Ngok and her husband arrived. Grandma, seeing everyone together, asked Aunt Ngok to help with setting the table for dinner. Soon, the family gathered around the table, laughing and chatting, filling the yard with joy. "Don't forget to help me tomorrow morning with the shopping and cooking for the ancestor worship ceremony," Grandma reminded everyone as we ate. After dinner, Grandpa sat with Uncle Tang and discussed the plans for the next day. Since it was Sunday, everyone had the day off to help. Grandpa looked at Uncle Tan and said, "Tang, listen to me. It's just the two of us now, father and son. I'm planning to rebuild your grandparents' grave. It's been over 15 years and it's in bad shape. If we leave it any longer, rats and bugs will dig into it. You and I will take care of the major decisions, and if your sisters can help, great. If not, that's fine too." Aunt Njok interrupted, "That's not right, Dad. It's not just about the sons. Building or repairing the ancestors' graves is everyone's responsibility. All of us sons and daughters alike should contribute." Uncle Hung, Aunt Ngok's husband, agreed. "Ngok's right, Dad. This is a family matter, and it should be shared equally. I'm sure even Brother Dad would have no objections." Grandpa nodded approvingly. "You're both right. It's good that you're thinking this way. In a few days, I'll speak with Uncle Nea and Aunt Han's family to see what they think. Since it's a family grave, we'll need to make sure everyone's on the same page." With that settled, Uncle Tang excused himself to leave, and soon after, Aunt Ngok and her husband followed suit. Before heading out, Uncle Tang turned back to remind her, "Behave yourself, okay? If I hear anything from Grandpa or Grandma, you're in big trouble." Her sheepishly replied, "Yes, Dad, I know. I won't do anything bad." She nervously hid behind me as Grandma chimed in. "Oh, come on, just leave her alone and go. She's always well behaved, no need to scare her. I'm sure you weren't so perfect as a child yourself." Uncle Tang just chuckled, said goodbye, and left. Soon, it was only the four of us, me, my cousins, and Grandpa and Grandma left in the courtyard. I sat next to Grandpa, my mind still on the nameless grave I had seen near my great-grandparents' grave earlier that day. Unable to contain my curiosity, I asked, "Grandpa, why does that grave near ours have no name?" Grandpa sighed, clearly understanding what I meant. "Are you still wondering about that? Well, do you want to hear the story behind it?" Immediately, my cousins and I chorused, "Yes, tell us, Grandpa." With a knowing smile, Grandpa glanced at Grandma and called out, "Ba, lock the gate, will you? I'm going to tell the kids a story." From the kitchen, Grandma's voice called back, "You better make it quick though. We've got a big day tomorrow, and they need to get to bed early, or they'll oversleep." Grandpa turned back to us, his face taking on a more serious expression. "All right, I'll tell you the story of that nameless grave. This happened a long time ago, probably over 15 years back. It shook the entire village of Nyanyetsa." As he spoke, I could see memories unfolding in his mind, as if the past was playing out before his eyes. Back then, there was a family, Mr. No's family, and that nameless grave belonged to them. It all started when Mr. No came over to speak with Mr. Le about a serious matter. Mr. No had nodded and said, "Don't worry. I've already arranged everything with the master. My wife and I will go there tomorrow, so you get everything ready. Let's get it done quickly. My daughter overseas has been pressuring us to hurry. I'll leave the logistics to you, just tell me the cost tomorrow. Now, I've got some things to take care of at home." With that, Mr. No gave a rushed goodbye, smiling as he left. Just then, Mrs. Le came back from the market and, seeing Mr. No leaving, greeted him before stepping inside. She looked at her husband, puzzled. What was Mr. No doing here? Ever since his daughter moved abroad and they got rich, they've kept to themselves. Now he's suddenly visiting us. What's going on? Mr. Le finished smoking his pipe and responded with a frown. "He's asking me to handle the exhumation for his family's grave." Mrs. Le was shocked. But who would he exhume? Could it be Mr. Tai? But Mr. Tai passed away just over 4 years ago. Isn't it too soon for that? Mr. Le shook his head. "It is for Mr. Tai. I also told him it's only been 4 years and it might not be the right time. But they've made up their minds. They're leaving the country soon to join their daughter abroad, and they won't be coming back to Vietnam. That's why they're rushing this." Mrs. Le, understanding the situation, nodded. "Ah, so that's why. Well, it's their family's business. Better not get involved, it's too much of a headache." She then stood up, saying, "I'll head over to the neighbors for a bit. I'll be back by noon to make lunch. In the meantime, you should go talk to a few people and arrange for help. We'll need enough hands for the job." With that, she left, and Mr. Le sighed, knowing full well she was off to gossip with the neighbors. This sort of thing happened every day. He grabbed his old military cap and hopped on his bike, pedaling over to Mr. Chin's house to discuss the exhumation. That night, in their small enclosed house, Mr. No and his wife, Mrs. Engu, were fast asleep. Outside, a ghostly figure appeared at the gate. It was Mr. Tai, with his cane tapping rhythmically as he approached the house. He stopped at the door, staring silently inside. A gust of wind blew through the window, waking Mr. No. Drowsy, he squinted and saw Mr. Tai standing by the door. He quickly sat up and called out, "Dad, is that you?" Mr. Tai shook his head slowly and spoke, his voice echoing ominously, "Do not exhume. Do not disturb the dead. It will bring death to all." With that, Mr. Tai turned and began walking away. Panicked, Mr. No shouted after him, "Dad, what do you mean? I don't understand." But Mr. Tai didn't respond. He walked out the gate and vanished into thin air. Suddenly, Mrs. Ango's voice broke through the fog of sleep. "No. Are you alright? What's going on?" Bolted back to reality, Mr. No gasped for breath. "I just saw Daddy was here, outside the door." He looked at me, shook his head, and left. "I don't know what it means." Mrs. Neo sighed, thinking he was stressed. "You've been worrying too much about your dad. That's probably why you're dreaming about him. Tomorrow, let's go see the master and follow through with the plan." Reluctantly, Mr. No agreed and laid back down. He soon fell asleep again, but outside the ominous tapping of Mr. Tai's cane echoed through the night. This time Mr. Tai appeared again, blood oozing from his eyes, nose and mouth. A shadowy skeletal hand reached from behind him, wrapping around his neck and pulling him down. His head was yanked off, blood spraying everywhere. Terrified, Mr. No screamed and woke up in a cold sweat. The morning light filtered through the curtains. Mrs. Neo walked in with breakfast, saying, "You're up. I made some noodles with eggs. Eat while it's hot." Still shaken, Mr. Neo asked, "Is everything ready to take to the master's house?" "Yes, I prepared everything. Just finish your breakfast and we'll head over." An hour later, they arrived at the master's house, placing offerings before him. "Master, we've come to ask for your guidance with the exhumation of my father's grave," Mr. Neo said. The master nodded and gestured for them to sit. "Write down his name and birth date. I'll see what I can do." Mr. No handed over the paper, and Master Bu retreated to his altar, beginning to chant. The sound of the bell rang softly, accompanied by the rhythmic beat of the wooden block. After a while, Master Bu tossed 2 coins onto a porcelain plate, but despite asking twice, there was no response. Turning back to Mr. Neo, he said, "I've asked twice, but there's no answer. Are you sure you've written your father's name and date of death correctly?" "Yes, I took it from the family records." "It's definitely correct," Mr. No assured him. Master Bu nodded and decided to try one last time. The coins spun on the plate, but they kept spinning, as if 2 unseen forces were in conflict. After more than 10 minutes, the coins finally settled. Master Bu nodded and turned back to Mr. Neo. "It's been approved. Now, let me check the best day for the exhumation." He mumbled to himself, calculating something silently. After a while, he looked up at Mr. No and said, "Normally, exhumations are avoided between June and September, but given your family's urgency, it can still be done. I've checked, and this month is May. As long as you avoid the monkey day and choose a tiger day, it should be fine. In fact, on the 17th of this month is perfect. It's a very auspicious day for moving graves. Today is the 15th, so in 2 days you should begin. Make sure to open the grave at midnight. After 12 a.m., I'll come to perform the rites, and by the hour of the tiger, I'll conduct the ceremony inside your home." Overjoyed, Mr. Neo and Mrs. Ngo bowed gratefully to Master Wu, thanking him before taking their leave. As they returned home, they saw Mr. Li waiting at the gate. He smiled as he saw them approach. "Oh, perfect timing. I was just about to come over. Let's go inside and talk." Once inside, Mr. No prepared some tea and served it to Mr. Lei, saying, "I've just come back from Master Wu's. He set the date for the 17th. I was hoping you could help arrange some people to assist. I'm relying on you for this, as I'm not sure how to handle it myself." Mr. Li took a sip of tea, nodding. So the date is set. The 17th sounds good, but aside from the exhumation, you'll need to have a grave built too. Have you found a team for that yet? Oh. Suddenly remembering, Mr. No realized he hadn't arranged for anyone to build the grave. He quickly replied, "Thanks for reminding me. Who do you think we should hire for the job? Or if you're available, would you take it on? Whatever the cost, just let me know. I trust you." Now Mr. Lin nodded. "Well, I was planning to talk to you about that. I wouldn't want someone else handling the construction. For the exhumation, it'll be 4 of us minus 1 million per person. So 4 million total. That's the standard rate. As for the grave construction, it'll be 200,000 VND per person per day, including 3 meals. If you don't provide meals, then it's 250,000 per day, Since it's all locals, it might be easier if they handle their own meals. Smiling, Mr. No said, 250,000? Let's do 300,000 per day. I want the job done quickly, and if you can get it finished faster, I'll happily pay more. My daughter's already booked plane tickets for the end of the month, so we need this done soon. Mr. Le sighed. All right then, I'll make sure it gets done. Leave it to me, and I'll gather the workers. As Mr. Le got up to leave, Mr. No suddenly called out, Wait a moment, Le. He disappeared inside the house for a moment, then returned with an envelope in his hand. Handing it to Mr. Le, he said, Here's the payment for the exhumation, along with an extra $1 million for you and the team. Surprised, Mr. Le replied, Why give me this now? We can settle up after the work's done. Mr. No smiled. Take it. I trust you, and I want to make sure everyone's motivated to do a good job. I'll pay the rest once the grave is built. Reluctantly, Mr. Le accepted the envelope, thanked him, and left. Mrs. Ngo, having seen the exchange, was puzzled and asked, Why did you pay him early? Wouldn't it be better wait until they're done? Annoyed, Mr. No snapped. What do you know? Sometimes you need to pay up front to ensure don't show things are done right. If they mess up and we're missing a bone or something, are we going to dig the whole grave back up? You have to grease the wheels, woman. Mrs. Ngo, taken aback by his irritation, said nothing more and went off to prepare lunch. After the meal, Mr. No lay down to rest. Suddenly he heard the sound of water splashing. Jolting awake, he felt droplets of water hitting his face. Confused, he tried to sit up, but found himself surrounded by darkness. Reaching out, he felt something wet and slimy. Pulling his hand back, he realized it was covered in mud. Horrified, he realized he was lying at the bottom of a grave. He tried to stand, but a cold skeletal hand grabbed him from behind, pulling him down and holding him in place. He couldn't move. The blackened, bony hand wrapped around his chest, squeezing tighter. Panicking, Mr. No screamed, Let me go. Let me go. I struggled with all his might, but nothing worked. Slowly, his body was pulled deeper into the muck. His head was just about to sink when, from above, a familiar, frail hand reached down, accompanied by a voice. Take my hand, No. Take my hand. Looking up, he saw the face of his father, Mr. Tai, staring down at him. Desperate, he reached out, his voice weak. Father, save me. The moment their hands touched, Mr. No felt himself being pulled upwards. A bright light flashed, and he squinted against the glare. At the same time, he heard Mrs. Ngo's voice. Are you awake? Are you all right? Opening his eyes, he saw his wife standing over him, along with Nurse 2 from the local clinic. Confused, he asked, Why am I here? And why is Nurse 2 here? Mrs. Ngo sighed and explained, Don't you remember? After lunch, you said you were going to the bathroom, but you didn't come back. I found you passed out in the garden. I had to ask Hon to help carry you inside. And we called Nurse 2 to come check on you. She said it was heat stroke and gave you a shot. Mr. No vaguely recalled that he had indeed gone to the bathroom, but after that, all he remembered was hearing someone call his name near the garden gate, and then nothing. He turned to Mrs. Ngo and said, It's all right. I probably just had heat stroke. Thanks, Nurse 2. Oh, Nurse 2 smiled and said, If you're feeling better now, I'll head back to the clinic. If anything comes up, don't hesitate to call. After seeing her off, Mrs. Ngo turned back to Mr. No, looking irritated. You need to cut down on drinking. What if this happens when we're visiting our daughter next month? What are we going to do then? Mr. No didn't respond. Lying on the bed, lost in thought about the strange dream he'd just had. Why had he experienced such a bizarre dream? He couldn't make sense of it no matter how much he thought. Perhaps it was just the stress of organizing his father's reburial that had led to such dreams. During dinner, Mrs. Ngo asked, still concerned, Tomorrow is the day we're moving your father's grave. Have you made sure everything is ready? Mr. No nodded confidently. Don't worry, I've got it all sorted. Tao and Tai will help in the morning, and Mr. Lee's team is handling everything at the gravesite. There's nothing to worry about. Feeling reassured, Mrs. Engo relaxed a bit. Later that night, just after midnight, Mr. Lee arrived at the house on his bicycle. He stepped inside and asked, "What time are we opening the grave tomorrow night? I need to make sure the men are prepared." Mr. No replied, "After midnight, we begin, make sure everything is ready, and we'll start as soon as the time is right." Mr. Lee nodded, and shortly after left. But just as he did, a large black cat suddenly jumped onto the windowsill, staring directly at Mr. No. The cat let out a few eerie, sorrowful cries, startled Mr. Neo dropped his cup of water, smashing it on the floor. The cat's eyes began to turn a deep, dark black, and it let out a low, haunting wail. Hearing the noise, Mrs. Engo rushed in. "What's going on? Why is everything knocked over like this?" Mr. No stood frozen by the door, as stiff as a statue. Mrs. Engo glanced toward the altar and gasped, "Oh my God, what's happening here? Why are you just standing there? Chase that cat away." A word snapped Mr. No out of his trance. He grabbed a broom and swung it at the cat. But instead of hitting the cat, the broom struck the framed photo of Mr. Tai on the altar, shattering the glass. Despite the noise and broken glass, the cat continued clawing at the photo. Sharp shards from the broken frame cut into the cat's paws, causing blood to smear across the picture of Mr. Tai. Mr. No swung the broom a few more times, and finally he hit the cat, causing it to yowl and dart off into the night. Picking up the blood-stained photo, Mr. No inspected it closely. The cat's blood had soaked into the cracks in the glass, staining the image of his father. Mrs. Engo, looking worried, asked, "What are we going to do now?" "We'll have to get a new photo made, won't we?" Still staring at the photo, lost in thought, Mr. No murmured, "Yes, we'll need to get a new one." But Mrs. Engo wasn't just worried about the photo. I don't mean just that, she continued. "Don't you think that cat's behavior was strange? Isn't something about this whole situation off?" Letting out a deep sigh, Mr. New replied, "Who am I supposed to ask about this? Maybe the cat's just sick, or maybe it's a bad omen. Let's get through tomorrow's Misburial for my father, and we'll figure the rest out later. We talk to Master Wu tomorrow. For now, let's just clean up and get some sleep. It's late." After putting the blood-soaked photo face down on the altar, Mr. No carefully locked the doors, determined not to let the black cat return. He and Mrs. Engo went to bed, and soon, the house was quiet, with only the soft sound of their breathing in the darkness. But on the altar, the photo of Mr. Tai slowly lifted as if an unseen hand had raised it. Blood-red tears began to seep from the eyes in the photo, dripping down as the picture tore itself in half. From outside, a voice called out, "No. Wo." The door creaked open, and a shadowy figure stood at the threshold, peering inside. Startled by the voice, Mr. No woke with a jolt. He turned to look out the window and was shocked to see his father, Mr. Tai, standing there. "Wee boss? Is that you?" he stammered. Mr. Tai stood there, smiling sadly as he slowly shook his head. No matter how many times Mr. No called out to him, his father simply shook his head, turned around and began to walk away. Panicked, Mr. No jumped out of bed and ran after him. Bo, don't go," he cried, chasing after the shadowy figure of his father. But Mr. Tai continued walking, faster and faster, until they reached the entrance to the cemetery. By the time Mr. No arrived, his father's figure had disappeared into the shadows of the graveyard. But just as Mr. No was about to give up hope, Mr. Tai turned around once more, looking at him with sorrowful eyes before disappearing further into the cemetery. His father finally stopped in front of a newly constructed grave. As Mr. No got closer, he realized it was his father's grave. Mr. Tai stood before the tomb, staring at it with a deep sadness. But before Mr. No could react, two gnarled black hands suddenly shot out from the grave, grabbing Mr. Tai and pulling him down. The figure of Mr. Tai was dragged beneath the earth and vanished, "Oh, no," Bo cried Mr. No. At that moment, a bone-chilling cackle echoed from beneath the grave, sending shivers down Mr. No's spine. The laugh pierced through his mind, and he awoke with a start, drenched in sweat. Looking around, he saw Mrs. and Joe still sound asleep beside him. Shaken, he got up, poured himself a glass of water, and took a long drink. As he raised the glass to his lips, he was startled to see the photo of Mr. Tai standing upright on the altar, despite him remembering that he had placed it face down. "I swear I turned that photo over," he muttered to himself. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, making him shiver. Glancing towards the door, he was startled to see it wide open. Frowning, he muttered, "That's strange. She's always so careful about locking up. How could she forget this time?" Mr. No stepped outside to close the door, but as he looked out toward the gate, his body froze in place. Standing by the gate was the shadowy figure of his father, Mr. Tai, staring directly at him with sad, mournful eyes. But Mr. No was paralyzed, unable to move. Just then, Mrs. Engyo came out of the house and saw her husband standing motionless in the doorway. "Hey, what are you doing out here in the middle of the night? Just standing there like that, you're going to fall over," she called out. Her voice jolted Mr. No back to reality. He turned around, stammering, "Oh, it's you." When he glanced back toward the gate, the figure of his father had vanished. Mrs. Ningyo, noticing the confusion on her husband's face, asked, "What's wrong with you? Close the door and go to bed, and don't forget to lock it." But Mr. No mumbled something incoherent about the door and wandered back inside. Mrs. Nego, puzzled, shook her head and said, "What's gotten into you? Talking nonsense about doors. It's just you, not me." Still confused, she walked over to lock the door herself, deciding not to press the issue. She was about to question him further, but when she turned around, Mr. No was already fast asleep, snoring softly. That night, at exactly 8 p.m., Mr. Lei, along with Chu, Tien, and Nam, gathered in the yard outside Mr. No's house. They were waiting for Ten to arrive so they could head to the cemetery together. The path to the cemetery wound through rice fields, and the night air was filled with the steady croaking of frogs. When they reached the cemetery, Mr. Lei turned to the group and said, "Light some incense and ask for permission first, then we can get started. Once the incense burns out, we'll begin." As the incense burned, they prepared for the first strike of the shovel. Suddenly, a clap of thunder echoed overhead, causing everyone to flinch. Dark clouds rolled in quickly, and the wind picked up, making the lanterns they had hung on nearby trees sway violently. Hugh looked around nervously and asked Mr. Lei, "Do you think something bad is going to happen?" Mr. Lei surveyed the area, then confidently replied, "It's just a storm coming. Don't worry. If it rains, all the better. The ground will be softer and easier to dig. Let's hurry and get this done." The sound of shovels slicing into the earth filled the air as they worked diligently. But just as they were making progress, a large black cat suddenly appeared, sitting on top of a nearby grave. Its glowing green eyes stared directly at the group. The cat let out a chilling wail, sending shivers through the men. Tien, who was digging nearby, threw a large clump of dirt at the cat in frustration, shouting, "Get lost, you filthy thing, or I'll deal with you." The cat bared its teeth, growling menacingly. Tien reached for another clump of dirt to throw, but Mr. Lei stopped him. "Leave it alone, Tien. Don't provoke it." Tien grumbled, "But it's creeping me out. If I wasn't so busy tonight, that thing would already be dead." Mr. Lei shook his head. "Don't cause trouble. If you accidentally hit someone else's grave, it will only cause problems. Let's focus on our work." Nam, standing nearby, chimed in, "Mr. Lei's right. You're new to this, Tien. Trust me, you don't want to anger the spirits by messing with the wrong grave." Well, the cat, seeing that no one was throwing anything at it anymore, licked its fur and eventually slinked away into the shadows. The sound of shovels resumed, but soon after, another loud thunderclap reverberated through the night. At the same moment, Chiu suddenly collapsed to the ground, his face pale as he pointed shakily ahead. "Mr. Lei, I just saw Mr. Tai standing over there," Chiu stammered. "Oh, Everyone followed Chiu's trembling finger, but all they could see were the uneven graves in the distance. Mr. Lee sighed. "You're imagining things. There's no one here. Get up and keep working, let's finish this." After more than 2 hours of hard labor, they finally reached the lid of the coffin. Mr. Lee tapped lightly on the wooden surface with his shovel and announced, "We've reached it. The coffin is right here. Be careful now. Don't crack the lid, we don't want any trouble." But the group worked carefully, clearing the last of the dirt from the edges of the coffin. About 15 minutes later, they had finished. The clock showed it was just past 11 p.m., so they all climbed out of the grave to take a break before opening the coffin. While they were resting, Q, still a bit shaken, asked Mr. Lee and Nam, "Have you guys ever seen anything scary while doing this job? You must have some stories." Nam, the most experienced of the group, thought for a moment before replying, "Well, there was this one time in the neighboring village that I'll never forget. Do you remember the giant eel, Le?" Mr. Le nodded. "Oh, I remember it clearly." Nam continued, "We were digging up a grave just like tonight when we opened the coffin and found this enormous eel inside, wrapped around the skull of the corpse. The thing was huge, about as thick as my thigh and over a meter long. It was bright yellow and had eaten most of the bones inside the coffin." Chiu looked skeptical and asked, "An eel? That big? How could it eat human bones?" Nam smiled and replied, "Believe it or not, it did. All the smaller bones like fingers and toes were gone. Even some of the larger bones like the leg bones were missing. It was terrifying." Still in disbelief, turned to Mr. Lee for confirmation, and when Mr. Lee nodded again, Chiu and Teen exchanged uneasy glances. Mr. Lee sighed and added, "Even I couldn't believe it at first. It's possible that when the body was buried, water seeped into the coffin, and the eel's eggs got inside. Over time, the eel grew by feeding on the body." Chiu, still unnerved, asked, "So what did you guys do after finding the eel? Did you kill it?" Nam shook his head, his expression grim. "We had no choice. The family decided to cremate the eel along with the remaining bones. It felt wrong though, almost like we were burning a person rather than an animal." The group fell silent after Nam's story, the tension in the air growing thicker as they waited for the clock to strike midnight, signaling the time to open the coffin. Chiu looked curious and asked, "So after you found the eel, what did you do? Did you burn it?" His question startled both Chiu and Tien as they exchanged shocked glances. Burn the eel? How do you even burn an eel?" Mr. Nam took a long drag from his cigarette, letting the white smoke curl into the air, adding to the mysterious atmosphere. He began speaking slowly. That eel had eaten the remains of the dead body. In a way, its flesh had become part of the deceased. So the family decided to burn the eel alive along with the skull. They gathered up all the bones to rebury them, watching that eel writhing in the fire, hissing and twisting. It was terrifying. It was as if we weren't burning an animal but a human being. The scene was horrifying. As Mr. Nam finished speaking, everyone around him shuddered. The thunder from the storm continued to rumble ominously above, heightening the eerie mood. Exactly at midnight, the sound of a motorcycle broke through the night. It was Mr. Wu, the spiritual master. As he arrived and saw the grave of Mr. Tai fully dug up, he nodded in approval. Setting down his ceremonial bell and wooden fish drum, he began chanting. The rhythmic clanging of the bell and the low knocks of the wooden drum echoed through the quiet cemetery, casting an even more haunting atmosphere over the scene. After about 10 minutes, Master Wu turned to the group and said, "All right, open the coffin." Mr. Lee grabbed the rope and descended into the grave. He wrapped the rope around the coffin of Mr. Tai, climbed back up, and gave a signal. "All right, on my count, 1, 2, 3, pull." Everyone pulled with all their strength, but the coffin felt impossibly heavy. Despite having 4 strong men pulling, the coffin wouldn't budge an inch. The wooden support beams began to creak and crack under the strain. Dew, growing more anxious, asked, "What do we do now, Mr. Le?" "The beams are breaking." With years of experience in grave digging, Mr. Le sighed and said, "If we can't lift it out, we'll just open it down here." "Fine, go get the alcohol." Then sprinted off to fetch the container of alcohol. Mr. Le took a crowbar and began prying open the coffin lid. The wooden boards groaned as they started to come loose. Mr. Le turned to the others and instructed, "Rub oil on your bodies and cover your faces. We're about to start." After everyone had prepared, Mr. Le prayed the last bit of the coffin lid. As soon as the lid lifted, an overpowering stench hit them. Even with the oil and their faces covered, the smell was so foul that TNMQ couldn't help but retch. Mr. Le and Mr. Nam, accustomed to this kind of work, stayed calm and continued. Mr. Le poured alcohol into the coffin to cleanse any negative energy. Once that was done, he began carefully removing the bones, placing them on the red cloth they had laid out beforehand. But suddenly Mr. Le froze, his face going pale. He stood up abruptly and called out to Master Wu, his voice shaking. "Master, there's something wrong here." Master Wu, surprised, walked over and asked, "What's wrong, Mr. Le?" Without saying a word, Mr. Le reached into the coffin and pulled out a second skull. The entire group gasped in horror. Chiu, already unnerved, collapsed to the ground, trembling. Master Wu stood up quickly, visibly alarmed. "Two skulls. How is this possible?" he muttered. "Wasn't this grave supposed to contain only one person? Someone needs to call Mr. No immediately." Then quickly ran back to fetch Mr. Nengo. As everyone waited, no one dared to make a move. About 10 minutes later, Mr. No arrived, his voice trembling as he spoke. "What's going on? Why are there two skulls in my father's grave? How could this happen?" Master Wu turned to him, his face serious. "We need to confirm whether these remains belong to two different people. If they do, it's possible that when your father was buried, his grave was unknowingly placed over an older grave." Mr. No stood there in disbelief. When they had dug the grave for his father years ago, the land was supposed to be empty. But now, seeing the two skulls laid out on the red cloth, he couldn't believe his eyes. Master Wu continued, "This situation will be difficult to resolve. It seems that your father's grave may have been placed on top of someone else's by accident." Mr. No felt a wave of panic rising within him. Once all the bones were collected, everyone had to face the truth. There were indeed two separate sets of remains in Mr. Tai's grave. Mr. Le lit a large bundle of incense and placed it by the grave. As the smoke rose straight up, he turned to Master Wu and said, "The incense smoke is rising straight. This confirms we've gathered all the remains, Master." Master Wu nodded and motioned for Mr. Le to pull the rest of the coffin out. This time the coffin was unexpectedly light and it was easily lifted out of the grave. But what they saw next shocked everyone. The bottom of the coffin was completely gone, as if it had never been there. Mr. Le sighed and turned to Mr. No, saying, "It's clear now. Your father's coffin was placed over another burial site. There's no doubt about it." Panicking, Mr. No asked, "But how will we know which bones are my father's and which belong to the other person?" Master Wu responded solemnly, "At this point it's impossible to tell. After so many years they've been resting together. Perhaps it's best to leave them that way now." Even though Mr. No didn't want to accept it, he knew there was no other option. He reluctantly agreed to follow Master Wu's advice. Once they had permission, Mr. Lee and the others began cleaning the bones. Though some of Mr. Tai's body hadn't fully decomposed, they had to chop bamboo into sharp sticks to scrape off what remained. As they worked, Mr. Le muttered under his breath, "This is bad luck, children. Cleaning up their father's remains like this is a terrible omen." But by 3 a.m., Mr. Tai's bones had been carefully cleaned and prepared. Mr. Le placed ancient coins at the bottom of the new burial jar, then lined it with gold paper and red fabric. Every step was performed with meticulous care. When the jar was finally sealed, the task was nearly complete. Mr. Le then filled the grave with jasmine flowers and quartz stones, ensuring everything was done properly. Mr. No turned to Mr. Lee and said, You continue here. I'll take Master Bu home to perform the ancestor ceremony. Before leaving, Mr. No pulled Mr. Bu aside and quietly said, "Listen, I need you to do me a favor. Don't tell anyone about the 2 sets of remains in the grave, not even the workers here. Please keep this between us. Afterward, come by my house and I'll give you a little extra for your help. I'm counting on you." Oh, Mr. Lee hesitated but eventually nodded. "I can try to keep this quiet for now, but if someone comes looking for their lost grave, I can't lie. These things are serious and I can't pretend forever." Mr. No quickly agreed. "If anyone asks later, tell them the truth. But for now, please keep this secret for me. I really appreciate it." With that, Mr. No and Master Wu left, while Mr. Lee and the team continued their work in silence, preparing to close the grave once more. Mr. No and Master Wu left to perform the ritual, while Mr. Lee and his team began building the new grave. Back at Mr. Mengo's house, everything for the offering had been carefully prepared: a fruit tray, bitter leaves, yellow chrysanthemums, white sticky rice, boiled chicken, rice wine, beer, cigarettes, tea, and especially a red gold votive tree. There were also 5 horses in different colors with accompanying hats, robes, command flags, and ceremonial swords and whips, all arranged neatly. Master Wu meticulously inspected the setup, then began the ancestral worship ritual. The sound of the wooden drum and chanting echoed steadily through the courtyard. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through, causing the items on the altar to rattle, and most alarmingly, the framed photo of Mr. Tai fell to the ground, shattering into pieces. Seeing this, Master Wu called Mr. Neyu over and said gravely, "There's an ill omen here. Once this ritual is complete, you should consult a higher level spiritual master to prevent any future calamities." Worried, Mr. No responded, "Yes, Master. I'll follow your advice. Please help us finish the ritual first, and I'll deal with that afterward." Master Wu nodded, instructing everyone to reset the offering table. The bell rang out again, its sound reverberating through the stillness of dawn. By 6 a.m., the ritual was finally completed. Before leaving, Master Wu gave one last piece of advice. "Don't forget what I told you. The sooner, the better. Don't wait too long, or it could lead to disaster." With that, Master Wu left. Mr. No and the others tidied up the area and took breakfast out to the cemetery for the workers. Before heading out, Mr. No discreetly slipped a thick envelope into his pocket. He smiled and said to the group, "Everyone, take a break and eat breakfast. I've prepared everything, eat as much as you like. If you need anything more, just let me know." Turning to Mr. Le, he whispered, "Mr. Le, I need a quick word with you." They stepped aside, and Mr. No pulled out the envelope, handing it to Mr. Le. "There's 15 million VND here, money for the grave construction and a little extra for the crew. Please keep everything quiet. We can't afford to have this getting out." Mr. Le nodded, accepting the envelope. "Don't worry, you can trust me. Everyone has agreed to keep it to themselves. As for the grave, we're following Master Wu's suggestion of building 2 compartments. By tonight it'll be done. When you're ready to engrave there the name, just let me know and I'll handle it." Mr. No thanked him, then made his way back home. By late evening, the grave was finally complete. Though the workers were exhausted after working continuously for over 24 hours, their spirits remained high, knowing they had earned a decent amount of money. That night, the Enu family hosted a small feast to thank the workers. After eating and drinking, Mr. Lei and the others, now slightly tipsy, waved goodbye and headed home. Poor Mr. Naingo, stumbling slightly, managed to make his way to bed. The night deepened and the cold mist enveloped the house. In the shadows, the image of Mr. Tai appeared again. He entered the house and approached the bed where Mr. No was sleeping. In his dream, Mr. No muttered, "Father, wait for me." The unsettling dream startled him awake. Feeling weary, he got out of bed, went to the table, and drank a full glass of water. He sat down, his face showing signs of fatigue. Lately, the constant dreams about his father had made him anxious. He remembered what Master Bo had said. and decided that in a few days he would visit Master Huang in the village to figure out what was going on. As he sat in deep thought, a sudden eerie laugh echoed from the altar, making him jump. A shadowy figure appeared on the altar, crawling back and forth like a monkey. It grabbed the fruits from the offering table and devoured them ferociously. Suddenly, the shadow turned to face Mr. Newo, baring its teeth in a twisted grin. Its raspy voice echoed, "From now on, you will worship me, just like your ancestors. If you don't, I will take all of you one by one." Horrified, Mr. No stared in disbelief and stammered, Who are you? Why are you here?" The shadow sneered, its voice growing louder. "Who am I? You dare ask me who I am?" With a crackling sound, the shadow contorted its body and lunged toward Mr. Neo, knocking him backward onto the chair. Its hands gripped his throat tightly, growling, "Your family dug up my bones and now you ask who I am? I'll kill all of you." The pressure on his neck grew stronger, and Mr. No struggled to breathe. Desperate, he choked out, I didn't know. Please, let me go." Just as he was about to pass out, the voice of his wife, Mrs. Nengo, called out, "Mr. No, what's happening to you?" Her voice snapped him out of the terrifying vision. He looked up to see his wife standing there, worried. "Exhausted?" he muttered. "Oh, it's you. What's going on?" Mrs. Ngo, still confused, asked. "I should be asking you. Why didn't you sleep in bed last night? You were lying here all night long. Were you trying to feed the mosquitoes or something?" It was only then that Mr. No realized he had been sleeping in the chair. He vaguely remembered waking up to get water but had no recollection of falling asleep there. Feeling drained, he stood up and replied, "I must have fallen asleep without realizing it. But where are you headed so early, all dressed up and with your bag?" "Going shopping." So Mrs. Nenju eyed her husband, concerned, and said, "Are you feeling all right? You used to have such a sharp memory, but lately you've been so forgetful. Today's the 18th. You forgot? I'm going to the market to buy supplies for the offering we're bringing to our daughter's house in a few days. You told me to buy them, remember?" Scratching his head, Mr. No sheepishly admitted, "Oh, right. I must have forgotten. With all the stress about my father's exhumation, my mind's been all over the place. Go ahead and do your shopping, and when you get back, I have something I need to talk to you about." Mrs. Ngo still felt something strange, but she shrugged it off and headed to the market. Back at home, Mr. No felt unusually tired, as if his body was floating. He sat on a chair, then lay down on the bed, unsure how to pass the time. Around 10 a.m., Mrs. Ngo returned from the market and went straight to the kitchen to prepare lunch. As they sat down to eat, Mr. No suddenly said, "There's something I need to tell you. Last night when we dug up Dad's grave, we found another set of bones." Mrs. Nengo was shocked. "What? How could there be another set of bones in your father's coffin?" With a sigh, Mr. Neo explained, "It's not like someone put them there. My father was buried on top of someone else's grave. In the end, the two bodies were lying together in the same burial plot." Confused, Mrs. Ngo asked, "But how could that be?" "The coffin was sealed. There's no way something like that could happen." Shaking his head, Mr. No replied, "The bottom of Dad's coffin had rotted away, but I don't know why. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Tomorrow, the two of us should visit Master Huang for help. Lately, I've been dreaming about Dad, but he never says anything." Mrs. Ngo added, "I've had the same dreams. Every night I see Dad standing at the gate, staring in. I've been too scared to mention it to you." After a long pause, Mr. Neo said, "That's it then, there's definitely something going on. Tomorrow we'll bring offerings and visit Master Huang to see what he can tell us." That night, Mr. Neo suddenly experienced a severe headache. After dinner, he went straight to bed. Seeing her husband in pain, Mrs. Ngo didn't say much. She quietly cleaned up the house and turned off the lights early. As night descended, a cold mist enveloped the house, In the middle of the night, as he slept, a shrill voice pierced the darkness. "Wake up. Wake up." The eerie sound jolted Mr. No awake. Like a man in a trance, he wandered outside. The door opened on its own, and before him stood a shadowy figure, facing away. The voice called again, clearer this time, "Follow me." Without resisting, Mr. No followed the figure. It glided along, leading him to the edge of the pond. Once there, the voice hissed into his ear, "Get in. I'll take you to see your father." But without hesitation, Mr. No stepped into the dark water and vanished beneath the surface. The next morning, Mrs. Ngo woke up and noticed her husband wasn't in bed. She searched the house and the yard but couldn't find him anywhere. Thinking he had gone out on an errand, she didn't worry at first, but by noon, after returning from the market, her worry grew when there was still no sign of him. She asked the neighbors, but no one had seen him. Alarmed, the villagers gathered to help search. But finally, when they reached the pond, they found Mr. No's lifeless body floating on the surface. Mrs. Ngo's cries of anguish echoed across the village. Their daughter, who was living abroad, immediately booked a flight and returned the same day. The whole village of Ngenja mourned for Mr. No, a man who had been preparing to enjoy his old age with his children, only to meet such a tragic and mysterious end. The funeral was quickly arranged, and the villagers came together to help with the arrangements. After the funeral, Mr. No's daughter, Hao, sat down with her mother and asked, "Mom, why did Dad die? He's always been so careful. How could he have fallen into the pond like that?" Mrs. Ngo, still overwhelmed with grief, had not been thinking clearly for the past few days. But now, hearing her daughter's question, she recalled the strange events leading up to this, especially the discovery of 2 skeletons in the grave. Determined to find answers, she decided to visit Master Huang. At Master Huang's house, after listening to everything Mrs. Ngo explained, he pulled out 7 coins and instructed her to call her husband's name 3 times, bow, and toss the coins to the ground. The coins clattered loudly in the stillness of the room. Studying the coins, Master Huang grew serious and said, "Your family has invited a demon into your home. It has driven out all of your ancestors. Didn't the black cat come into your house recently and scratch your father-in-law's photo? That was him trying to warn you. He's been trying to send messages to your family for a while now, but no one listened. Now your husband is gone, but you and your daughter still have a chance. You need to go to your new grave. I'll help you resolve this." Mrs. Ngo agreed without hesitation. Together with Master Huang and her daughter Hao, they went to Mr. Kai's grave. When they arrived, Master Huang instructed them to remove the ancestral tablet from the grave. Worried, Mrs. Ngo asked, "Why do we need to remove the tablet, Master?" He explained, "The demon has attached itself to your father-in-law. If he can enter your home, so can the demon. We need to remove the tablet to sever the connection between your family and him. From now on, you can only make offerings at the grave, not in your home." After the tablet was removed, Master Huang had Mr. Le take both the tablet and the framed photo to a larger river to discard them. He then performed a ritual to break the connection between the family and Mr. Tai before finally leaving. After that, Mrs. Ngo and her daughter left the village and moved abroad. The nameless grave remained in the Ngenja cemetery, where it still stands to this day. As I finished hearing this story, a shiver ran down my spine. I finally understood why the grave next to my grandfather's had no name. It was, without a doubt, a grave full of dark and terrifying secrets. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to this mysterious and eerie story. We hope you enjoyed the suspense and chills as much as we did sharing it with you. If you love spooky ghost stories like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell so you won't miss any of our new videos. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment below to help our channel grow and bring even more thrilling stories to life. Once again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.